Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, SBC 209 Interpersonal Communicators. We are here to lecture today on Chapter 13, Small Group Communication. Okay? So first of all, let's get something out of the way. Everybody hates small group communications. That's why it's Lucky Chapter 13, I believe. Our impression of small group communication usually comes from group assignments that we had to do in school. They just sucked. We all admit, all right, I'm going to adjust the camera here just a little bit. We all admit that nobody likes group assignments. Why? Because there's, in a group, there's 5 people, there's 2 people that do the work. There's one person who does nothing but little the work the other 2 are doing. And then there's 2 people that never show up and get the same grade everybody else does. Okay, we all know that's how group assignments works. But in our real world business environments, we use small groups a lot to get things accomplished. Tasks are oftentimes assigned to small groups. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how small groups work, okay? And influences that impact them, all right? So let's talk about small groups, okay? First of all, a small group is equal to or greater than 3. You have to have a minimum of 3 people for a small group. Okay, if you go back to our lectures very early on, 2 people is didactic. That is not a small group. So 3 members is a minimum, but the upper limit, it depends. Okay, as the answer is for almost every question in communications, the correct answer is it depends. Okay, a lot of things can have an impact. First of all, there's proximity. All right, if you're trying to get everybody together for physical meetings, okay, you can't have a large number of people dispersed over great distances. It just becomes impossible to get everybody together to have the meetings, okay? There's perceived social status. Okay? If you've got people of multiple different social levels, that can have an impact on how they engage each other. All right. So if we had a group of professors and students engaged in a small group, the number of people involved from each of those different levels would have an impact. It can be impacted by communications capacity. Now these days where everyone's used to having practically unlimited bandwidth, okay, where you don't have to worry about a dial-up modem that's at 56.6 K, we feel like we have almost an unlimited communications capacity. Number one, that's not always the case. All right, if you're going to have people scattered all over the world, and you're going to now it's possible to have a virtual small group where you've got one person here in Augusta in the CSRA, you've got another person in Virginia, one person in Oregon, one person's in Niger, one person is in France, one person is in Tokyo, one person. The ability to communicate back and forth between those and get everybody in a Skype session, okay, or a FaceTime session. The person in Niger or China or maybe even parts of rural Virginia or even parts of rural Georgia or South Carolina, they may not have the bandwidth available to go into a FaceTime or a Skype meeting like that, okay? So if you're communicating solely by email, that makes it even harder to maintain your small group cohesiveness, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, okay? So there's all sorts of issues that will impact the upper limit of how many people can be in it. Proximity, social status, communication capacity. Here's one other thing that you want to think about, okay? When we're talking about just the size. So first of all, if I have 3 people in a group, all right, there are 3 potential connections. 1, 2, 3. That should be fairly self-explanatory, fairly easy to grab a hold of. 3 people, we'll call them members and connections. So with 3 people, you have 3 connections. That's pretty straightforward. Let's say I add a 4th connection, a 4th person to the group. So we've already got those 3. We're going to add a 4th, a 5th, and a 6th. So with 4 people, we have 6 possible connections. All right? With 5 people, so let's add a 5th person up here. We're starting off with 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So with 5 people, we have 10 possible connections. Okay, I'm going to stop drawing here in just a second because it's going to get out of hand. With 6 people, we have 15 possible connections. So this is raising by a factorial level. With 12 people, we have the possibility of 66 connections. All right, so what you begin to see as you get into, is we're climbing by, I think it's factorial. I'm not a mathematician, but you're increasing more with each person you add on. Okay, and it's not just you add in 1 person. You then add in, when you go from 3 people, you have 3 relationships. When you add a 4th person, you have 6 potential relationships. When you add a 5th person, you're now up to 10 potential relationships. 6 is 15, and then when you get up to 12, you're up to 66 potential separate relationships. Okay? So that's why most people put the upper end at between 8 and 12. Okay? Because once you get past 12, you're really no longer a small group. Okay? You would wind up having too many possible connections. It's you lose the synergy of having individuals interacting with each other. You wind up then having to appoint a boss or a supervisor of the group. And then you wind up shifting over from something like this, where everyone is connected with each other. When you have 7 or 8, this is 9. You wind up having things like these people are connected. These people are connected. And then these people may all have 1 person that engages with this key central figure, okay? And we could model this out a whole bunch of different ways where each one of these will have contact with that individual, okay? But this key person here is now not in a small group. This person is now administering 2 separate small groups. So once you get to where it becomes this complicated to try to communicate with each other, you're losing the benefits of having a small group, and you're really getting drug into multiple small groups, which raises the complexity, because then you have to worry about it. We're going to talk about this in just a second, or in just a minute. You start talking about things like who's the manager, who's in charge of the small group, okay? So we have at least 3 members. The upper limit can change based on proximity, perceived social status, or issues like proximity, perceived social status, communications capacity. There's any number of others, level of expertise among members, assigned tasks. We're going to get into those in a second. But remember, as you increase in size, the number of potential relationships increases faster than you add members in, to where when you've got 12 members, you have 66 possible connections. And at that point, you're really getting beyond the scope of a small group. So we're going to say the upper limit is 8 to 12 based on the number of connections within the group. Okay? So let's talk about the structures of small groups. Now, small groups, the structure is usually influenced by 2 things. First of all is the internal influences. The internal influences. The internal influences can be something like a well-informed person emerges as a leader. Highly motivated people, so a leader will emerge or can emerge. Okay? That person can be either well-informed or highly motivated. Okay? Members of the group will gravitate toward roles. Now, when I was working in small groups, when I was working before I left federal service, whenever we had a small group, I was always the guy that got to make the phone calls. Because the community I worked in, we had a lot of introverts. We had a lot, I mean, to be blunt, we had a lot of nerds, and I don't say that as an insult. And they just didn't like to use the phone. They'd rather send an email. But if somebody had to pick up and use the phone, that oftentimes gravitated toward me because I'm more of an extrovert. Okay? The emerging leader can assign roles. Now, in some cases, if you don't let the members naturally gravitate toward the roles, if that's not happening, and you start assigning those roles, that can have a negative impact on group cohesion. Because if you assign somebody a role that they're not suited for or they just don't want, then that could be a problem that can interfere with group cohesion. Okay? All right? So these are some of the internal things. A leader can emerge through their knowledge, their expertise, or just their motivation or desire to be the leader. Members can gravitate towards specific roles. That can affect how things work. Or then the leader, when they emerge or when they are assigned, can start assigning roles, and that can either help or detract from group cohesion. Now, the other thing, if one's internal, if somebody says something, there's two things, and one's internal, you pretty much bet the other one is external. Okay? And the first thing that's going to dictate how the group, the structure of the group is resources assigned. Now, the resources assigned are not only going to be material, but also personnel. How many people are going to be in the group? What kind of assets are you going to have access? Okay? Am I going to have access to an entire conference room? Can I take over that conference room for the month? Are you going to give me extra computers to do this? Do we have a budget so that we can go out and see things outside the office? All those things are an issue. The key one is probably going to be how many people get assigned to the small group. A lot of times I had the experience where they were told, okay, Vic, get together, you're going to run this small group. And then they'd assign me like 16 people. And I'm going like, okay, well, just so we're great, I understand that, but you need to know going in, I know that that's not going to work as a small group. That is two small groups. I'm going to split them into groups of two groups of, one group of 8, one group of 7, and then I'm going to be the leader. Okay, and usually my bosses were okay with that. Oftentimes, I've actually had times when I looked at a boss and said, hey, listen, appreciate all those resources. I only really need 8 people. Okay, 16 is just going to get in the way because we need to be dynamic, we need to shift, we need to be more fluid. So sometimes, the personnel and materials assigned is going to have a negative impact. So you want to be aware of that. There will be roles assigned by external authorities. Okay? Usually when somebody in a business or in the government or in the military, they say, okay, we're going to get together a small group, and you're going to, they don't say just figure out who's in charge. They will assign someone to be in charge. Okay? And a lot of that is for accountability purposes, because if the small group doesn't achieve its task, they're going to want to know who to come after, want to know who to talk to. Okay? So the roles in the group may be assigned by the external pressures. Okay? We've already talked about resources available. Okay? And then the other thing that they are probably going to put down is going to be, okay, time. Now, a lot of times, a lot of instances, you're going to ask, when your boss says, hey, listen, I want you to take charge of a small group. Here's the 5 people that you're going to have for you. We're going to give you this conference room. We're going to want you to get this done. And you go, great, boss. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate this opportunity for excellence. One question you should always ask is, hey, how much time do we have? And a lot of times, your managers are going to go, hey, take whatever time you need. Well, that's not true, okay? A lot of times they'll say, take whatever time you need, and then they're going to come back the next day and say, I need it tomorrow, all right? So that completely, if we have all the time in the world, then you can sort those things out, okay? You can take your time, let people, as we said, let people sort of gravitate to the roles they want. If you're leading a small group, or if there's a small group, even if there's no formal leaders, and you found out you've got to have everything done in 48 hours, that completely changes the structure of the group. Becomes more 5 individuals working in concert as opposed to one small group working together. So the structure of the group can be impacted by external forces like resources assigned, and that's going to include material resources and personnel, the roles assigned by the external managers or forces, and then the time you're given to complete your task. Okay? All right. So, the last thing that's going to affect, and we've talked about internal forces, external forces, we're going to be talking about communication pathways. All right? Okay? A lot of times how people communicate will be based on their assigned roles, the size of the group, okay? And what communication means are available. Right now, a lot of times you're going to find when you're assigned to a small group, you're not all necessarily sitting next to each other. That would be the ultimate experience. But in reality, in anything other than a small organization, even if you get to a little, just barely above small business or small group, you're going to wind up with people that are very disparate, that are scattered all over the place. A lot of times, especially when you're talking about nonprofit organizations or volunteer groups, what you're going to find is that the small group that you've been assigned to work with is a very, very small portion of the time they spend in any given day. My wife is on the board of the United Way of the CSRA. They meet once every 2 months. They get emails occasionally asking them to do stuff, and she responds to those, okay? But the people that work there, when you're asking them to do something and you're asking for that small group, most of the people aren't going to be available if you want to actually get people physically together, okay? So the availability for communication has a big impact on the structure and how the group works, okay? So let's talk about some other characteristics of small groups. First of all is interdependence. Interdependence. In interdependence, by definition, small groups have to share a common purpose where every member of the small group is working toward a common goal of some sort, or should be working toward that, all right? Actions of 1 or 2 members can affect the entire group and the success of the entire group's actions. All members must understand, either implicitly or explicitly, that their actions affect the success of the entire group. If you do not have interdependence, if people in the group cannot rely on each other, if people in the group do not understand that their actions are going to affect the overall outcome of the entire group, then you're going to have some really key problems within the group, okay? There also needs to be a shared identity for it to be successful. Now, shared identity can be either formal or informal, okay? I usually ran my small groups with and tried to develop an informal shared identity. I knew people that gave, the first thing they wanted to do was they said, hey, let's have a team name. And I would go like, we meet at 10 o'clock. Let's call that the name. Because I just really was about getting on with the work. You can have team names. You can have T-shirts. You can have a special meeting place that you guys, use as a rallying point. Okay. But you need to be aware that there needs to be some sort of shared identity where there is some sort of communal experience that everybody in the small group has been involved in. Now, in some cases, that sort of gives itself like we're running a small group within the administrative board of your church. You all have the shared identity of that faith group. But with others, like when you're suddenly just working in a large corporation and 5 people get thrown together all at once and you're told to get to work on this, you may have to, if you're the leader, do something aggressive to develop some sort of, proactive, to develop some sort of shared identity. Okay? There's also, within the shared identity, you have to be aware of what's called in-group and out-group. All right? Now, in-group and out-group is basically like being back in high school. All right? Sometimes some people will adopt the shared identity of the small group. You'll have a group of 8 people. 3 people will be totally on board with the shared identity. The other 5 people may not engage that shared identity and may come up with their own identity. Okay? You have to be very careful of that with a group dynamic. All right? So in-group and out-of-group is part of forming a shared identity, and you want to make sure you keep everybody with the overall shared identity so they all have that level of interdependence. Okay, so let's talk about some functions of small groups. Why do we have small groups? Well, first, we meet instrumental needs. It's just sometimes easier to accomplish necessary tasks, okay, by having a small group do it. All right? We can serve individual needs. Small groups allow you to build cohesion, inclusion, control of the environment. If you have a small group, that way people feel like through that shared identity, through that interdependence, people feel like they have a group that they can rely on to help them control their either work environment, volunteer environment, whatever sort of environment they're working in. Okay? Small groups help you meet identity needs. Now, by identity needs, okay, what we're talking about is that members develop their individual identities from group membership. Okay? Remember, if we go back several weeks to culture, and we said that you draw your identity from the specific culture that you're engaging with, even if your experience is to reject that culture, you're still engaging with it. So within the workspace or volunteer organization or wherever you're forming these community associations, wherever you're forming these small groups, they will develop their own social culture. Okay, remember we talked about personal culture, social culture, okay, and public culture, our identities, okay? So this small group will help individuals meet their identity's needs, okay, their identity needs. It will give them a sense of belonging and a sense of place. It will give them the interdependence, and again, from a purely organizational aspect, it helps you meet your instrumental needs or the required task associated with your group, larger group. All right, so let's talk about advantages. All right, first of all, the advantages for the individual. Okay, the first advantage for the individual is that it improves productivity. All right, so if my office is responsible for a task, and we're all, it's an 8-step task, all right? Division of labor, something that was developed back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, said that if I do step 1 and 2, you do step 2, 3, and 4, you do step 5 and 6, and you do step 7 and 8, we will get more accomplished than if I do 1 through 8, 1 through 8, 1 through 8, 1 through 8. If you can focus on a specific task, you will get more done. Okay? So one of the advantages for an individual is it improves productivity. It improves skill sets. Now, by improving skill set, we know that everyone doesn't know everything they need to know about their job in all likelihood. Okay? So if you've got somebody who's very experienced, if you've got 2, 3 people over here that are very experienced, and 5 people over here that have just come on the job, putting the 8 of them into a small group where those 3 people can share their skills with the other 5 people is going to benefit these 5 people. Also, and clearly it benefits the 5 lesser experienced people. But through learning new techniques and new ways to accomplish the task, the other 3 more experienced people will have their skill sets improved as well. Now, if you've got 8 people that are all relatively the same level, they just come from different backgrounds, having all of those 8 people together, sharing their skill sets and experiences will benefit everyone immediately. Okay? There is also, for the individual, an issue of self-awareness. Whoa. Okay? By being around other people and seeing and experiencing their strengths and weaknesses, you can better identify your own strengths and weaknesses. And that will help you gravitate in the future toward roles that are more suited for you. Okay? So that's the advantages for the individual. Increased productivity and performances will result in a sharing of mutually beneficial skill sets, and it allows the individual to become more self-aware. So let's talk about advantages for the organization that forms the small group. Okay? First of all, okay, advantage for the organization. First of all, there's focus. All right? A manager can spend more time with each person on a smaller team. Okay? It just allows them to engage better. All right? There's clarity. When there's fewer people to go through to communicate a message, everyone is in line of sight of everyone else, so it's easier to communicate a clear, precise message. Okay? There's cohesion. Small teams stick together better through that shared identity. They begin to work together better. So in a lot of times, it is a good thing to have to break large groups into smaller groups so they can build that team cohesion. Now, one of the things you also need to be aware of when it comes to cohesion, small groups also have a tendency to tear themselves apart once things start going bad. So you need to, as a manager, if you're organizing small groups, be very much aware of that. Okay? Small groups are easier to administer. Okay, they're easier to administer or administration. You know, I need to recruit, train, and bring fewer people into the organization, so we spend more time doing real work as opposed to trying to find more people to come in and do the work. Okay? There's more positive interactions. The interactions involved can be done more easily, more on an individual basis as opposed to a broad cultural basis, and it improves that sense of commitment and that interdependence that each group member feels toward the common goal. And then finally, there's visibility. Visibility means that as the group leader, okay, you can't have anybody that's working for you hide. You know, we've all been in classrooms where there was 30, 40 people, and you would sit in the back and don't make eye contact and always act, and you can probably get away with not reading your assignments and not having any questions asked of you that day. Okay, when you're in a small classroom with only 8 people, you can't hide. Same with small groups. Okay, a small group, because of the visibility, it improves accountability. Okay? All right, so let's talk about the phases of small groups. And this is laid out pretty well in your textbook, so I'm just going to brush through it really quickly. There's the 4 steps, and I will tell you, I've been through a million small group classes. This is, you're going to hear this if you're engaged in business. This is the thing to talk about. It's called forming, storming, norming, performing, and this book added on the last one, adjourning. Okay, we'll take them each in turn, right? In forming, okay, the primary goal is to reduce uncertainty among members. Okay? And this is where you begin to increase uncertainty while you increase cohesion. This is where everybody sort of gets to know each other, where everybody gets involved in the group. During storming, you're going to have an increase in conflict as people begin to sort out their roles in the group. Okay? If there hasn't been a formally appointed leader, there will be a leadership struggle. If people don't like either the roles they're assigned or the roles that they're being gravitated to by the group, they will push back. There will be conflict. The thing you need to realize is this is not a negative phase. Okay? But there will be an increase in conflict, but it is not negative. Every group, small group, needs to go through this so that everybody understands their role. What your job is as the group leader, or even as a member of the group, is to make sure the storming phase doesn't get personal. Okay, you need to make sure you're focused on how these conflicts impact the overall goal, and how resolution of these conflicts in the storming phase will ultimately add to the ability of the team to produce. Okay, during norming, standards are going to be set. For the military, we call them standard operating procedures. You may call them performance and policy standards. There's any number of ways of doing it. But standards are set and procedures are formalized. Now, by formalized, I don't necessarily mean that you have to write them all down, although in some small groups, if you're going to be around long enough and you're going to have transition of members over time, yeah, you may want to actually make that a formal, write it down sort of thing. But usually what it means is, okay, Bob, you're doing this, Sally, you're doing this, where every day at 2 o'clock we're going to meet to discuss what everybody's accomplished in the last 24 hours. Okay? In performing, this is where the work gets done. You've built your unit cohesion, you've sorted out all the conflict, you've set a standard procedures and how everything's going to be done. When you get to performing, this is where you actually start doing the work. But in addition to that, you will develop additional efficiencies here. Okay, but what I mean by that, when you start the performing piece, you need to go back and look, because you're still, remember, when you're norming, you're just beginning to get over the conflicts. As time goes on, as you build a group cohesion, as you sort out everybody's roles and they gravitate toward their own roles or they accept the roles that they've been assigned, people are going to realize that there may be better ways to do things. So you're going to build in a system within your group to include those efficiencies. Now, a lot of people misinterpreting performing as this is where we just drive through to the end and get it all over with. That is not what performing is about. Performing is where you're doing the task, but you're also performing as a cohesive group. Okay? The maintenance of the group and the cohesion of the group is part of performing as much as accomplishing the assigned tasks are. And then finally, adjourning is when your task is accomplished. Now, here's the thing. There's 2 ways for that to happen. You can have a formal task accomplishment point where, okay, when we get this process in place and we publish this paper, we're going to be done. It's formal. Paper is out there. It's in the journal. We can now disband this group, and you will have a formal adjourning process. What oftentimes also happens, though, since your management or whoever created this small group doesn't necessarily give you a specific defined end state of where you want to be, a lot of times the adjourning process can be slow, it can be tedious, and it can be very contentious. Okay? When people start seeing that, when people no longer see the benefits of performing, they will begin, group cohesion will begin to break down. Okay? So you need to be aware of that fact. If you're the group leader, or if you're even a group member, and you begin to see that you're sort of involuntarily moving into the adjourning phase where people just don't see the benefits of being a member of the group anymore, that's when we need to start having conversations about, hey, we're not really through with performing yet. We have to continue this task. We can't move to adjourning yet, or it may be time for everybody to say, hey, let's get together. Do we still need this small group, or have we already accomplished everything? Okay? All right? So forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning are the 5 phases of the life of a small group. Okay? That sounds like a dynamite final exam question. I'll have to figure that out. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how we keep that small group together. How we, the types of cohesion. So first thing within a small group, there's basically 2 types of cohesion that were at work. There's task cohesion. All right, task cohesion oftentimes happen when you have a small group and you're into that storming phase, and everybody's really getting on everybody's nerves, and so the person who is the appointed, or the person who has asserted themselves as a group leader will go back into whoever formed the group and said, we're not just getting along. I don't think this is going to work. This small group is not doing it for us. And whoever formed that small group will go, I don't care. I gave you a job. Get your butt back in there and get that job done. Okay? At which point, that perceived leader or appointed leader will go back into the group and go like, hey, listen, if we don't get this done, we're going to get fired. I don't care if you hate each other. I don't care if you think you're sitting next to Satan. We're getting this task. And everybody goes, all right, you're right. We got to get the job done. And so they focus on getting the job done. They agree on the purpose and the work of the group, even if they don't necessarily like the other members of the group. The other type of cohesion is what we call social cohesion. Now, social cohesion is where everybody in the group likes each other, and they like being together, and they like working together. Hopefully you will have a little bit of both. It's not good, and it can be contentious, okay, if people hate each other, but they're just there for the job. Okay, it's also not necessarily a good deal if people don't care about getting the task accomplished. They just like getting together and having a good time. Okay, so hopefully you'll get a little bit of both. But let's talk about how you make cohesion better. First of all, make sure everyone participates. Nothing will kill the cohesion of a group quicker than 1 or 2 members of the group not participating, either through some sort of malevolence on assigning tasks. And I've seen this before where, 1, 2, 3, and 4, you're going to do all of this work. 5 and 6, just hang out over there. We'll get with you in a minute. Well, 5 and 6 are going to get pretty disillusioned and think they're wasting their time. The other 4 members of the group are going to go, I'm working my butt off over here. 5 and 6 aren't doing anything. Okay? So cohesion, okay, participation is an aid to cohesion, works on the simple principle that we all like it when we all work. Okay? Make sure you're getting feedback. Nobody likes the old mushroom bit. Where you're kept in the dark and fed nothing but manure. People like to know how they're doing in their job, even if they're not doing well. Nothing will kill group cohesion more than people not being told how they're doing and how what they're doing is contributing to the overall goal or missions of the entire larger organization. Okay? Make sure that there is equity, and this goes along with participation. Make sure everyone is treated fairly. Because when we're all in this together, we all have a stake in how it comes out. Make sure roles are well defined. Nothing will kill a group quicker than when one person takes it as their task to either do everybody else's jobs or even worse, to judge everybody else's job. Okay? So if you've got one person who isn't really doing what they need to be doing, they're focused on telling other people how to do their stuff, and they're not the group leader, then that's going to cause tension, and that's going to cause a decrease in cohesion. And then finally, everyone, you need to focus on motivation. Remember, you're not necessarily looking for minimal performance, okay? And again, I've had a million bosses when I look at them, and it's like talking to your father, especially, and I came from the Department of Defense where most of our people were military. And people would look at me and say, I said, well, sir, why are we doing this? And they would just look at me and honestly say, because I told you to get out of my office. Well, yeah, that's a reason for me to put forth minimal effort. Now, if I want to be motivated, when I would used to have small groups, I would bring the small group working for me, I would bring the small group leaders in and say, hey, listen, make sure your people know this is why we're doing this. It's going to contribute to the overall goals of the organization. It's going to contribute to our overall mission accomplishment. Make sure they understand that. And when I was checking up on my small group leaders that were working for me, I would make sure that they had everyone participating, was giving everybody feedback. They had there was equity in the work, roles were defined, and I looked toward their motivation, just to make sure that everybody felt that unit cohesiveness. Okay? Now, I'm not going to tell you that it's all bed of roses out there in small groups. There can be problems. Okay? First of all, there's this thing called groupthink. That's where unit cohesion becomes so important and conformity becomes so important that those become the primary goal. Not accomplishing the task, not doing what you were assigned, but just simply getting along with the group. Okay? There are hundreds of instances, Google groupthink. There are hundreds of instances where entire organizations just march themselves off a figurative cliff because nobody was going to say, hey, stop. The biggest one right now that's going on is with we'll be talking about as a case study for decades, is the Boeing 737 MAX, where there was a safety issue that resulted in 2 crashes, fully loaded, 300 people killed. And everybody knew when they went back and then when they did the investigations, everybody at Boeing was like, well, yeah, there was a problem. But our unit cohesion would not allow me to say, hey, this is a problem. Groupthink took over, and it's because Boeing builds the safest aircraft, because Boeing has always built the safest aircraft, and people weren't asking those hard questions. Same thing happened with the Shuttle Challenger when it blew up, is that everybody had gotten into this groupthink mentality that, hey, clearly, if there was something wrong, somebody would say something, so I'm not going to say anything. And the idea of sticking your hand up to say, hey, listen, I have a problem. It becomes something where people are not, that is not advocated as a way ahead. So the flip side of groupthink is conflict. Now, conflict can come in 2 different varieties. There's procedural conflict, and that's just conflict in how the group is getting its work done, okay? Hey, listen, this isn't the best way to do this. Well, it's the way I said we were going to do it. Okay? Procedural conflict has to do with the procedures, as it says, within the group. Procedural conflict is a conflict based on how the group is getting its work done, okay? And a lot of times, procedural conflict will come up in the performing stage. Well, wait a minute, you said all the conflict was going to be in storming. No, I said we needed to keep looking for efficiencies, okay? And sometimes when you get those procedures down and they keep working and everybody just sort of says, this is the way it's always been, that argument ad hominem, or an appeal to tradition, and we're just going to grind through it, okay? Then conflicts can arise over that. The other type of conflict is what we call substantive conflict. In substantive conflict, okay, it's a conflict between the members and can involve disagreements over the purpose, the values, and the ideas of the group. This is a more core issue. This is procedural. It's just like, okay, let's just figure out the best way to get this done. Substantive conflict can be, why are we even in this group now? Okay, does this group need to exist? Why are we even bothering to do this anymore? Okay? Of these two, substantive clearly can be the hardest one to cope with, because you go back and you have to re-examine some of the most basics of why the group exists. All right? Finally, on conflict, one of the things you need to be aware of, it is not inherently bad. Okay? In fact, lack of conflict, a total lack of conflict within a small group indicates a complete lack of engagement and involvement by the members. I mean, if everybody comes in and nobody cares, nobody's going to argue. Okay? You know, they say that the problem, a lot of times in a marriage, the problem isn't when people argue, it's when people stop arguing. They're just giving up. They're not fighting for the relationship anymore. Same thing goes with small groups. If you don't have some sort of conflict on a regular basis, and it doesn't have to be, people throwing haymakers at each other. If people just aren't, having some tension every now and then, it probably means they don't care about the group anymore. And now you're beginning to have some negative impact on cohesion. Okay? Resolutions, especially like procedural conflicts, even can bring efficiencies. Substantive conflict can improve group cohesion. Okay, so don't shy away. And I've been in small groups where the leader of the group, as soon as people came into conflict, either procedural or substantive, as soon as the conflict sort of to evolve within the group leader just squashed it, just killed it. Okay, so if you have a substantive conflict between people over the nature of the group, personalities of the group, any of those things, you still are going to have those conflicts and those tensions. And if you don't draw them out and use it as an opportunity to build cohesion, you now run the risk of losing group cohesion over something that you tried to squash. So remember, conflict is not inherently bad. It can be useful to building group cohesion and strengthening bonds within the groups. Okay, all right. So that's small group communication. I will be posting everything I need to post here in the next day as soon as I get this uploaded. And we'll see you around.